Hello, I'm Dan Gibson and welcome to another video in the series Archaeology and Islam. In this video, we will address the question, where was ancient Paran? We are going to look at a variety of different sources of information. We will start with how Paran is mentioned in the biblical and then the Christian accounts, and end with the Islamic accounts. In all of this, we will ask ourselves the question, when the ancient records speak of Paran, what area do they have in mind? Some people may react at this point and respond and say, this is stupid because Paran equals Sinai. And while I agree that the name Sinai often appears alongside of Paran, after examining the sources, I think they are two separate places. Others will tell you that Paran is in Saudi Arabia, and it is the area around Mecca. And others will place it in northern Sinai. If you check maps on the internet, you will see that Paran is shoved around here and there on the maps. In different maps have it in different places. So, in order that we are not fooled or misled by what people are saying about Paran, let's review what the ancients said about this place. So, let's start with a map. And we can place Egypt and Edom on this map. These we can nail down even though the borders may move around from time to time. The southern border of Edom has always been fixed. It is a large, expansive escarpment that drops several thousand feet from the high desert down to the low desert below. And it runs from east to west, making it a very distinct border. Ancient forts and defensive structures dot along the top of this escarpment. Now, up above on the escarpment, there are fields, there's moisture, there's villages. Below the escarpment, there's desert, rocks, sand dunes. Now, for several years, I lived with my wife and my children near the top of the escarpment, and my children played along the edge of the escarpment with the hot desert just below them. It was always 5 or 6 degrees cooler at the top of the escarpment. Now the ancient kingdom of Edom was at the top of the escarpment, and the land of Edom extended back north, back into the mountains, and chief among these mountains was Mount Seir, where the city of Petra was eventually located. Along the western side of the mountains, we have Wadi Araba, which is very distinct and very similar to the lower deserts. Now, the mountains of Sinai and the Negev are way off to the west. Now, the problem we have with these places is that there are no ancient signposts or inscriptions in stone that tell us this is Sinai, or now entering Paran. So we need to understand where these locations were from the ancient accounts. For thousands of years, we have understood that the peninsula between Egypt and the Middle East is known as the Sinai Peninsula. Now in the 21st centuries, a few people are promoting the idea that the Exodus was from Egypt into Saudi Arabia, and some have suggested that perhaps the desert in Saudi Arabia was the original Sinai. But as you will see, it really doesn't matter if you put Sinai on the right or on the left, because Paran is associated with Mount Seir and with the deserts south of Edom below the escarpment. So, let's start with Paran in the earliest biblical records and then move forward. The biblical book of Numbers, chapter 10, verse 12 to 16, tell us that the children of Israel took their journey out of the wilderness of Sinai, and the cloud rested in the wilderness of Paran. A few verses later, verse 16, the people removed from Hazeroth and pitched in the wilderness of Paran. So, without addressing here where these are, we need to notice that Sinai and Paran are two distinct different places. The children of Israel move out from Sinai and into Paran. So please remember as we go through this, Sinai is not Paran. But Sinai and Paran are close. They are related in some way. They could be described as two wildernesses that are side by side. So something separated them to make them distinct wildernesses. This may help clear up a lot of misunderstanding, because I keep meeting people who believe that Sinai and Paran are names for the same place. Now, let's turn to the two verses in Deuteronomy chapter 33. That's verses 1 and 2. This is the blessing that Moses, the man of God, blessed the children of Israel before his death. And he said, The Lord came from Sinai, and he rose up from Seir unto them. He shined forth from Mount Paran, and he came with 10,000 of his saints. From his right hand went out the fiery law for them. Now, we have three terms here. One is Sinai, one is Seir, and one is Mount Paran. So on our map, let's take note of Sinai. And as far as we know, ancient Seir has always referred to the Edomite mountains, especially to the mountains where the city of Petra was later established. So on our map, let's fix Seir over Petra. And I'm going to place Paran here on the map so it is beside Sinai and south of Seir. So they can come out of Sinai into Paran, and Seir is located on the north. Now, it really doesn't matter where I put Paran. I can shove it around if I need be. From the verses that we read, we learn a bit more about Paran, because Moses refers to Mount Paran. And Moses should know because he traveled twice through this area extensively, once herding sheep for his father-in-law, and once leading the children of Israel. So now we know that Paran is not just a wilderness, it also has mountains in it, and one that is notable as Mount Paran. Now another interesting verse from Genesis 14, that's verse 5 and 6, and this is way back during the time of Abraham. Paran is mentioned during a rebellion against Chedorlaomer. I spoke about him back in video 16 of this same series. He is now understood to be Kudur-Kukumal, the king of Elam. Here in Genesis it says, In the 14th year came Chedorlaomer, the king, and the kings that were with him, and they smote, and then it lists a bunch of the kings and peoples, and it ends up with, and the Horites in their Mount Seir unto Paran, which is by the wilderness. That would be this area between Mount Seir and the wilderness. It could be south and it could be east. So now we have Sinai on the west, Seir is up here, and Paran is in the lower center and east of Edom. We can always move Paran, as we said, as we need to, if we need to shovel it around a few places. Now these are the very ancient names that go far back into history. Paran comes from a very old root that could mean beautiful, and indeed the deserts of Paran contain amazing beauty. Even to this day, tourists come from all over the world to visit the wonders in Wadi Rum, which according to this definition would be in the wilderness of Paran. Genesis 21:19-22 tells us that when Ishmael grew up, he lived in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother Hagar got him a wife from the land of Egypt. 1 Kings 11:17 and 18 tells us that when Hadad the Edomite fled from Edom to Egypt, he passed through Paran on his way to Egypt. Now, some early Christian writers mention Paran. Both Eusebius in his Onomesticon, which is an early biblical dictionary. Also Jerome reports that Paran was a desert in Arabia, and he calls the city of Eilat, that's on the Red Sea, Eilat, he calls it Eilat Paran. So here in the south we can anchor Paran to this area south of the escarpment. The Book of Jubilee, written possibly around 140 BC, or maybe much earlier, tells us that Ishmael and his sons, and the sons of Keturah, who was one of the wives of Abraham, they went together and dwelt in Paran to the entering of Babylon in all the lands which are towards the east, facing the desert. And these mingled with each other, and their name was called Arabs and Ishmaelite. Therefore, the reference, or the inference here, is that Paran also covers the desert east of Mount Seir, all the way over to the Babylonian border. Since Mount Seir is the Petra Mountains, this is telling us that Ishmael moved into the desert east of Petra, and he occupied the whole area as far as the borders of Babylon. And this is what we find in Babylonian and Chaldean records. They ran into the Nabateans, the tribe that was descended from Nabaioth, the eldest son of Ishmael. They ran into them in the desert, and also they ran into the Kedarites, a tribe that descended from Ishmael's second son, Kedar. So this places Paran in the area between Mount Seir and Mesopotamia. So we can see that Paran is actually now a very large place, but it means the wilderness south of Edom and to the east of Edom. So in review, we can see that Paran is in the wilderness to the east of Sinai, and that it warps its way around up through the borders of Edom, and it extends out to the eastern desert. And we have specific mention of it south of Edom, that includes Elat Paran, and it extends out to the area of Wadi Rum, and then into the deserts east of Edom. Now, Cebios, the Armenian bishop and historian, describing the Arab conquest during his time, wrote that the Arabs, quote, assembled and came out from Paran. Today, many Muslims point to Cebios as proof that Muhammad is mentioned in a non-Islamic history and that Muhammad really existed, but they fail to note that Cebios places Muhammad in the founding of Islam in the area of Paran, not in Saudi Arabia. The only major city near Paran was Mount Seir, known to the Christian West as Petra. That name was given to the city by the Emperor Hadrian, who visited it in 130 AD. And from then on, it was known as the name of Petra, or Petra's Hadrian, but many people just called it Petra. However, for the centuries before this, even long after the city was known as Petra, it still had other names, and some of the ancient names like the name Rechem. And now Cebios tells us that the Muslim army started from there. There is another Armenian writer, Thomas Artzruni, who wrote before his death in 887 CE. I have spoken of him before this in this series and talked about him. Artzruni tells us, at that time, in the place of Arabia, Petria, Paran, named Mecca, the Mecca, he showed himself to bandits, warriors, and band chiefs worshipping in a temple. Artzruni is very specific when he mentions a place. Arabia, Petria, Paran. Now, Arabia Petria was a Roman state. Paran specifies where in the Roman state it was. Then Artzruni says something truly amazing. The place is called Mecca. The Mecca, he writes, being very specific. Here the writer clearly calls the place the Mecca and places it in Paran in southern Jordan. Listen carefully. Thomas Artzruni gives the location of Mecca as Petria, Arabia, Paran. These are Christian names. They are places well known in the Christian Middle East. Bishops have come from this place to participate in major church consultations. Great theological debates that sometimes split the church were influenced by Christian leaders from Petra. So he's not speaking of something nebulous, just out there. And he tells us that the Arabic name for this area is Mecca, the Mecca. Now, why does he emphasize this? Because by the time of this writing, Petra, also known as Mecca, is now abandoned, and the name Mecca has been transferred to a location in Saudi Arabia. And in his time, the only use for the word Mecca was referencing to Saudi Arabia. But Thomas Artzruni is early enough to remember that the city of Petra had also one of its names for that area was Mecca, the Mecca, he says, and he places there Muhammad revealing himself to bandits and warriors and tribal chiefs and worshipping in a temple, which we know today as the Kaaba. So please understand the importance of this. as we have said before, the city of Petra had multiple names. It was known as Seir, also known as Rechem, after an early king who lived there. It's also known as Petra, a Roman name. But to the polytheist Arabs, the area there was known as Mecca. And Thomas Artzruni says the Mecca, just so you know for sure that it is the Mecca. And he places it very distinctly in Paran, in Arabia Petrea. That's why identifying the land of Paran is so important. But today many Muslims believe that Paran is an area around Mecca in Saudi Arabia. And they've been told that Mecca is in Paran, which is true. We can see this from what we've learned so far, but for those who do not know where Paran was traditionally, they have concluded that Paran must be in Saudi Arabia, around the area of the Mecca in Saudi Arabia. Regardless of where Paran had been all down through history, they don't care. Now, before we go any further, let's listen to what some of the earliest Arabs say. The Arab geographer Al-Muqaddasa mentions that the Red Sea branches into two at the northern extremity of Al-Hijaz at the name of a place called Paran. So he places Paran or Paran in the northern location. He says that from here the Red Sea divides into two. The northern area is going up is Paran, and Hijaz is to the south, the area going south. Now this is the traditional understanding of Paran, and it gives us a southern border. Now this is an early Muslim geographer, not some Roman Christian. Paran is not in Saudi, around Mecca and Saudi Arabia. He's placing it in the northern area, and Mecca is therefore in the north. Yaqut, the most famous Muslim geographer, who's writing around 600 years after the start of Islam, tells us that Paran is an Arabized Hebrew word, and it is one of the names of Mecca mentioned in the Torah. Now that's interesting. The name of Petra, you see, is not found in the Bible. It's there, but it's Seir. The name of Petra is not found in the Islamic records, and the name Petra is only found in the Roman records. It was specific to the visit of Hadrian in that region. The name then stuck, and it was used by the Romans, but other names were applied for this city. From the early Islamic records, we learn that Paran is, broadly speaking, north of the Hijaz, stretching along the east side of the Red Sea up through Jordan over to Sinai. This is where Ishmael and some of the other descendants of Abraham settled. This is Paran. Now, when the old Arabic translation of the Samaritan Pentateuch was translated into English, that's back in 1851, in that old manuscript there was a footnote found, and it said the name Paran or Paran refers to the wilderness and the mountains near Mecca. Now at this point all anyone knew was that Mecca was in Saudi Arabia, so nobody had ever heard that Mecca might have been in another place. This is 1851 when it's being translated, so they assume that it was talking about Mecca in Saudi Arabia. Now, but remember, the Samaritan Pentateuch goes back several hundred years BC. But we do not know when that footnote was added. It may have been early, and it may have been later. So unfortunately, we cannot date it. But what we do know is that these scribes only knew Paran as the desert south and east of Edom. It wasn't until several hundred years into Islamic history that the name Paran started being applied to the area of Mecca in Saudi Arabia. So at the time of the writing of this footnote, it is most likely that Mecca in Saudi Arabia did not even exist yet. Now, as I've often said, there's no record of archaeological background in Mecca. Certainly, it doesn't go back centuries before Christ. There's no Temple of Alat. There are no deities there. There's all the archaeological things that should be there are not there. And on top of this, there's not a single surviving mosque from the 1st century of Islam that faces Mecca in Saudi Arabia. Instead, all of these mosques face the region of Paran in southern Jordan. Another early Islamic writer, Al-Hamdani, writes in his book, Geography of the Arabic Peninsula, that the Paran Mountains were around Mecca, and they were named after Paran, the son of Amalek. Az-Zuraki also mentions the Amalekites as associated with Mecca. Now, the history of the Amalekites is relatively well known, and we know the Amalekites lived north of Edom, never in Saudi Arabia. Eventually, the Amalekites were wiped out, but listen, Mount Seir is given as the location where the remnant of the Amalekites escaped to. We find that in 1 Chronicles 4, verses 42 and 43. And some of them, even the sons of Simeon, 500 men, went to Mount Seir, having for their captains Pelatiah and Neriah and Nephiah and Uzziel, the son of Ishi. And they smote the rest of the Amalekites that had escaped and dwelt there unto this day. So, once the Amalekites were defeated in the north, some escaped south as far as Mount Seir. They're living there, and so 500 men of the sons of Simeon come and attack them, wipe them out. So, it is true that the remnant of the Amalekites lived in Mount Seir, the name for Petra, before it was ever called Petra. And the Islamic records tell us that at one time there were Amalekites living in Mecca. Again, the ancient name Mecca is more appropriate for Petra than it is way down in Saudi Arabia. Another interesting detail, Al-Samani, in his book Surnames, tells us that the surname Firani is derived from Paran or Paran, the mountains near Mecca. So again, Paran and Mecca are associated together. In another instance, Wahib ibn Munabbih, who died around 730 CE, writes a book called Kitab al-Nizan, which is a compilation of pre-Islamic folklore. And he mentions that Tel Paran, or the mountain of Paran, is on the outskirts of Mecca. Now, this may give us a clue as to how the name Mecca applied to Petra. It may have applied only to a specific mountain or a group of mountains in the Petra region. Now, in another instance, Ibn al-Munabbih suggests that the name for Tel Paran was the Mound of the Two Runaways, which was a place where the Jehoram tribe found Hagar and Ishmael and referred to them as two runaways. We have already placed this story near Petra or in Petra in another video. But in this case, when the original use of the name Mecca is given, it might have referred to a mount or a hill or a mountain, so to the Tel, and it could have been any part of a suburb of Petra. Now, before we close, we need to deal briefly with the association between Paran and Sinai. The earliest I can establish this is the geographer Ptolemy, who identified Paran as being in the Sinai. And so Claudius Ptolemy identified Wadi Sheikh as Wadi Paran, and forever after this it was written on European maps. He also identified Al-Heswa oasis. He called it Paran oasis. And so around 550 AD, Christian monks established a monastery there and called it St. Catherine's Monastery. But they never hinted that they believed they were living in Paran. As far as I know, this is how the association, though, began between Paran and Sinai, was with Ptolemy and him drawing and making his maps. Now, as I said at the beginning of this video, the early records clearly talk about the children of Israel leaving Sinai and entering Paran. They were not the same place. Also, we've noticed that Paran and Mount Seir are often associated together. So now, in closing, let's examine these two hypotheses. First, as the Muslims would have us believe, Paran is and always has been the area around Mecca in Saudi Arabia. Or, second, Paran became associated with Mecca and Saudi Arabia after the name Mecca started being applied to the Saudi location. This happened after the area known as Mecca in Jordan was destroyed by earthquakes, war, and people abandoning it. Today, an argument of Paran has been used against my assumptions that nowhere in Islamic history is there any support for the city of Petra. I have countered and said Petra was a Roman name applied to the city by the Emperor Hadrian, and that name caught on in the Roman Empire, but the original names for the city and the area still existed in Arabia. If Paran is in the area east of Sinai and south of Mount Seir and north of the Hejaz, as we have learned, then the descriptions fit both the biblical and the early Christian and the early Muslim accounts. Nobody's making any mistakes. But if Paran is to be only identified as a nebulous area in central Saudi Arabia around Mecca, then all the other references don't make any sense. They all have to be mistakes. So how did the Muslim scholars of the last 1,000 years miss this whole thing that there could be two Meccas? First of all, they weren't looking for another Mecca. And second, they had a good explanation. Paran is the area around Mecca and Saudi Arabia, and they accepted that. And third, they believed that their Islamic historians were all correct and everyone else was wrong. My approach was different. Once I realized that all of the Qiblas of the first century of Islam faced the area around Petra, I began examining other data and historical accounts to see if they supported or contradicted the data. In conclusion, people who don't want to be convinced will just reject this video, and they will reject Paran, and they will reject Petra. But for those who want to piece together the evidence, they will find that by placing the original Mecca in or near Petra, all of the pieces fit together. I'm Dan Gibson, and this has been another video in the series Archaeology and Islam.